Take a picture of it, show it on the internet.
So happy birthday.
Yes. Getting young.
Another year wiser.
Or at least another year. Starting downhill. Oh, you don't know downhill. Not yet, anyway.
I think, do we want to go ahead and get started? I think this is probably all.
Maybe ask for introductions. Let me start it.
You want?
Yep.
Sure.
All right. So welcome everybody to here. We've got several of us here in the room, and Sam Funk, can you hear us still? Yes, you can. So Sam, this is, of course, you know my voice. This is Spence. We've got several of your old friends here in the room. It sounds like you went go-karting with several of them quite a few years ago when you were at Illinois. So we've got Sampath, you know him, Denny Harding, Ed Kordick, Rick Robinson, Laverne Sanders, Dave Miller, Tim Johnson, Patricia, who you know from our team, myself, and then of course Michelle is here. So we're actually recording this, and then we will put it on the website and share the link here when we're done. So I will turn the time over to Michelle.
Thanks, Spence. We want to welcome everybody here today. This is kind of an idea that was started by Sampath. We were hoping to do some little seminars every once in a while and keep everybody here at Farm Bureau and our other friends who have connected online in the loop on some of the projects we have been working on. So I was volunteered to do the first one because I have recently completed and defended my thesis through the K-State Master of Agribusiness program. And so we're going to start off with a quick presentation on my project. So the topic of my project was farm management implications of uncertainty in days suitable for field work. And I worked with Dr. Terry Griffin and a few others there at Kansas State University. A little bit of background. We all know here how much weather and climate affect farmers and their operations, but it's obviously something that they cannot control. So this project focused on understanding some of the historical trends in days suitable for field work and how that can help farmers in their farm management decisions for their operation. So obviously the days suitable for field work that they have available can alter many of their choices, from machinery capacity to what crops they're going to plant, seed purchasing decisions, as well as many more. So the focus of this, as I mentioned, is on days suitable for field work, and then I'm going to tie it into the example of machinery capacity. Producers obviously need adequate equipment to plant and harvest their crop in the allocated time. And if they are under-equipped, they're going to suffer a yield penalty, or maybe they won't get all their crops in. And so there are definitely some challenges that come along with that. So the question is, how bad of a year should farmers plan for? And this information is not only applicable to farmers, but also policymakers, you know, people here in this room at Farm Bureau, ag lenders, as well as equipment manufacturers. So the three main objectives of my project: the first one was to demonstrate any changes in the time that farmers are typically planting or harvesting their crop over the past 30 plus years. And the areas that I studied were Iowa, Kansas, and Missouri. And then the second objective was to analyze the days suitable for field work trends at the state and the crop reporting district level for those three states mentioned. And then tying these days suitable for field work trends back into machinery purchasing decisions and you know, how much machinery somebody should carry using a cost-benefit analysis. So this is the boring stuff. The literature review, I'll just go over this quickly. Days suitable for fieldwork is something that has been tracked and analyzed going back to the 1970s. Many of you in this room know Dr. William Edwards, and he had done quite a bit of research on this for his dissertation, actually, back in 1979. And since then, many others have also researched this topic. As I mentioned, the year-to-year fluctuations cause the number and distribution of days suitable for variable. And so this question of how bad of a year do you plan for is is a question that many decision makers are still trying to figure out what the best level to carry is.
So I'll ask a question.
Okay.
If you're going to cover it, where that, I recall that day suitable for field work is just a term that NAS developed and that county extension agents and others report to NAS on a weekly basis. Is that right? Yes,
that is correct. And so I'll kind of cover that here. So the three main data sets that I used for this project were the corn planting and harvest progress, which comes from USDA NAS and is in their weekly reports. And using that data, I calculated a most active week. You'll hear me use that term quite a few times here. So that most active time frame we defined as between 15 and 85% complete. So whether they're planting, they're somewhere between 15 and 85%, or during harvest, the harvest progress, they're somewhere between that 15 and 85% completion level. So those were the most active weeks that I looked at in this study. And then, as you mentioned, the days suitable for field work, their definition of that is the number of days per week with soil conditions that allow for field work. And so, as you had said, it's collected by USDA NAS and reported by them, and it's a combination of extension agents, local people at the county that are submitting their data, and then it goes in and it's averaged out for each crop reporting district. And then the final...
But it's a very subjective...
It is, yes. Yes.
Term.
It is, and that's another thing I found once I dug into the data more, that there were some holes in the data, and obviously it's very subjective, and so you have to understand that. It's the best data we have available, especially going back that far. And that's part of the reason the three states that I chose were the most complete, and they also went back the furthest. So we had the most data to look at and analyze, because Iowa, Kansas, and Missouri were some of the first states to actually start tracking that. So, and as I mentioned, the data is imperfect, so there were some years that were excluded, which you'll see later on. So, for example, one more recent example is in 2013 with the government shutdown during the harvest. There was a week or two there that we didn't have that data for like harvest progress. And then there were some years earlier on, kind of in the early 80s, the data was still a little spotty. So if the data was not complete for a year, it was just excluded. And then the final set of data that I used was the Purdue linear programming farm model. And so that we used some assumptions that they have made in that model for my cost-benefit analysis. And we'll talk about those a little more later. So the two key methods used were regression analysis to determine if there was a statistically significant trend in the days suitable for field work during both the planting and harvest season for the three states mentioned. And then a cost-benefit analysis to determine what the optimal days suitable for field work to plan for is in order to minimize your machinery and yield penalty costs. So moving on to the fun stuff, the results. This example is a distribution of the Iowa days suitable for field work over 42 years with complete data during planting season. So that most active set of time was calculated, and that the most active actually didn't change that much over time from the beginning to 2016 data. But I used the most recent 5-year average, the weeks that were most active. So that's the week number. Those are the week numbers that I used that are shown here. But when you're determining the planter size, it is through the literature review I found, they say you want to plan somewhere between the minimum and the median number of days suitable for field work. So the median actually falls in right here about 15 days. So in Iowa there was 4 weeks that are considered most active for planting. So out of those 28 days, the median is right at 15 days that you could expect to be suitable to be in the field. But as I mentioned, the median isn't really where you want to plan for. It's somewhere less than that. So a lot of the literature talked about the 20th percentile, which is going to fall in there right around 12 days. So when you're thinking about, you've got 4 weeks, and out of that 4 weeks, you only have 12 days to get all your planting done. You want to make sure you have the right size machinery in order to meet that. And then additionally, there was one set that had some pretty high years, and then there were 2 years that had less than 10 days in there as well. So there is a lot of variability, and when you're looking at it from a crop reporting district level, you can see some that I pointed out here in the northeast part of Iowa. You can plan for about 13 days. And so that last slide was just at the state level, but here in northeast Iowa, it's about 13 days. However, if you're in southwest Iowa, you could only plan on 11 days at that 20th percentile. So there is some variance across the state. I obviously talked about Iowa today because it's most relevant with most of our crowd here. But in Kansas, you see even more variation across the state. Kansas looks a lot different from one side of the state to the other. And so that's something that farmers want to consider. Obviously, I don't know many farmers that farm in northeast Iowa and southwest Iowa. But even when you're looking, somebody might be farming in a few counties that could be in different crop reporting district levels. So even across county lines, there is some differences that you want to be aware of. So when you look at it during the harvest time frame, there's actually a lot less variation. So you can see these all look a lot more similar. And the median here fell, just to show how close they are, the median for all of these crop reporting district levels in Iowa was between 26 and 27 days. So those were all very close. Obviously there's a little variation, but for the most part, during harvest time, it's a lot more similar across the state.
It does appear that south central Iowa has a skew to the lower end.
Yep.
Same for the planting one.
On the, yeah.
Yes,
yep, south central, this one definitely, yeah, that one was way lower. So that's one place where you would look at, somebody might be in these two areas or have some counties in between there. And,
you're looking at him.
Yep, Dave knows. Dave knows you have a very short window to get everything in the ground.
Well, and I guess what I noticed there is it's the only one that really gets down into that 2 to 4 days suitable.
Yep. And that was something when I was going through all the data, there was a lot of cleaning of the data because some years they would be missing like 1 week. And so obviously that would bring that way down, if you're looking at the year for total. But yeah, south central Iowa definitely was a lot lower. And as you can see, this is one that I had to adjust the scale a little bit because here in northeast Iowa, there were so many in that one, the 15 to 17 around there, that there were so many that fell right in that window. But yeah, down here, they're definitely skewed a lot more to the left. So then I took all the days suitable for fieldwork data that I had gathered and cleaned and ran regression on each of the 3 states during planting season and during harvest season, during those most active weeks. And the only 2 that came up with statistically significant trends was Iowa during planting and Missouri during harvest. So what that means is those actually saw a significant positive or negative trend in one direction, whereas these other ones, there was not a significant trend. So most of those were just scattered so much that there wasn't a clear trend one way or the other. So here's the regression for Iowa. So in Iowa, you could expect the slope was negative, as you can see here, negative 0.123. So you could expect over a year's time, you would lose, 0.12 days, which that's not that much. You're not going to think about that, but in a 10-year window, you could lose a little over a day. So that's something to think about. And obviously, Iowa is the leading state for corn production, and so we know here in Iowa that there's less and less farms and farmers, and the farm sizes are growing. So you need to think about, as these farms continue to grow and we're seeing less days, how do you manage your machinery in order to accommodate that?
Another way to present that, Michelle, might be, because that is significant, over a 2-decade period, which is fairly typical planning period for a farmer, over 20 years, you're losing 20% of your days suitable for field work.
Right, and I think...
Because you're losing 2.4 over a 20-year period, and that's about 18 to 20% of your days suitable for field work are going to be lost.
Right.
From the time you kind of buy a new planter to when you maybe you're done with it, over that 20-year period, you've lost 20% of your.
Right, and so there was a lot of interesting discussion in my thesis defense on this. You know, there's so many more things you can break off of this, but yeah, some of the things we talked about were farmers. For example, my dad, who has farmed the same farm for his whole life, he is going to make a lot of his decisions based on how he's always done it. I've had this many acres, I've had this size planter, this is how it's always worked, I'm going to continue doing it this way. But you know, that might not necessarily be correct moving forward. You know, if you're seeing some changes, that doesn't mean he's going to go out and buy a new planter today just because he's losing, you know, a few days over the next few years. But if a new generation transitions in, that might be a good time to evaluate, you know, do we really have the right size planter? Is this accurate for what we're planting now? So there was definitely a lot of interesting discussion, and as Dave had said, you know, over 10, 20 years, that becomes a little bigger issue than, you know, maybe just 1 year. And so just so you know, we did run the math. Not in any of our lifetimes are there going to be no days suitable for planting in Iowa. So,
hey, Michelle, this is Jay Rimpey. I was just going to ask that. So can I infer that at some point in time in the future that there'll be no corn production in Iowa and it'll all shift to Kansas or Nebraska? I'm assuming Nebraska is similar to Kansas. So
well,
you are getting diminishing days.
so one of the things that yeah, go ahead.
It goes back probably to the idea of just winter. They talk about Iowa having wetter springs more often.
Yep.
I think that's what it goes back to. It'd be interesting, especially. Obviously, you probably have a little bit different climate issues because Kansas and Missouri to our south. But if Illinois had enough data, what would it look like over the across the corn?
So that was another thing that we talked about a lot, and ways that you could build on this analysis. So you look here, and there's kind of this cluster down here. And so if you tied these years to like precipitation, this trend line might just be saying that the wet years are outweighing the dry years now. Because we know by living here that we've had a lot of wet springs lately, and so that is likely why it's pretty low in here. And another thing is there's some very almost outliers. We know that they're quality data, but another thing that you could analyze is go back and remove some of these crazy high or crazy low data points and see how influential those are. So this point way up here might actually be pulling this up. And so that would be another thing to go back and look at and see how influential some of those points are.
Talk to Jean, and she will cut down all this out.
Yeah, Jean could do all this like that. Yeah.
So Chris Anderson was the one that was saying we have a wet spring. Since 1980, we have a wet spring once every 3 years. Prior to 1980, it was once every 10 years. So that's a trend that he identified and talks about.
Right.
Yeah, the other thing, again, you might just, again, additional analyses you might look at is what is the change in has there been changes in frequencies? And that's, you know, I've done a little bit on that, but Chris Anderson, you've followed some of his work. Your base periods really matter there, what you choose as the base and comparisons, but there's no doubt we have moved both the mean and the standard deviation on precipitation and temperature in April and May, at least for Des Moines. Again, it really does get locational specific, but when you look at the state of Iowa as a whole, or you look at central Iowa, some of those, we've definitely seen that. But the other thing is, what is the frequency of, for example, 10 days or less?
Right.
Because I really don't care if I've got 42 good days out of 28.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
What I
And
care
that's
about
it's that low end that you need to be prepared for,
Yeah.
and at what point do you just take the loss, you know, based on your machinery costs. You only want to carry, you don't want to have way more machinery than you need, but obviously you do have to plan for those bad years.
Well, the other, again, just anecdotal observation is southern Iowa, because of land costs, has had more, I'll call it northern Iowa, southern Minnesota guys farming, coming down and doing some farming down in southern Iowa. And what they're finding out is they don't have the days suitable for field work that they had up in northern Iowa, and we're getting a lot more prevented planting.
I was going to say, that was another thing we talked about quite a bit in my thesis defense, is that prevent plant issue, again, that we had a few years ago. So if you've got a farmer he's got a really big planter and he, farms in a few counties across the state, but if he only has 10 days suitable to get everything in, out of 4 weeks, and he's in the wrong place at the wrong time, it might not matter if you've got a huge planter. So another question that you could build on from this is, at what point are you better off to have 2 planters and pay for that additional cost so that you can be in 2 places at one time? And so that also goes back to the issue of, the farms are getting larger, and so at what point does that make sense?
Well, and a tertiary issue that's associated with it that at least some of the young guys down in southern Iowa talk about is when you have prevented planting provisions in crop insurance that essentially guarantee the cash rent, these guys are coming in with a government subsidized put underneath their, because they don't put the nitrogen on until they plant, which is probably a good thing. They don't put the seed in the ground. And so they're able to actually bid up cash rents because of prevented plant provisions that allow them to acquire acreage whether they kind of get it planted or not.
Right.
Right. Their opportunity cost is much nearer to zero.
Yeah.
There's no risk.
And it's probably, there was probably some locational bias in that, again, one of those policy implications to look at sometime down the road is to, are there any patterns of this tied to prevented plantings, other types of policy observations?
Yeah, a lot of times you have multiple locations to manage or reduce risk, throw away the preventive planning thing. Here you could actually have multiple locations that add to risk.
They're adding to government subsidized risk. If you didn't have, quote, as lucrative preventive planning provisions as we do, people probably would not be taking that risk.
Yep. So obviously there's a lot of good conversation that goes around this, and a lot more research that could be done. And so we look forward to any ideas, on things that you guys think would be useful to add to this.
We can talk it all about, and it's more going forward than anything, is planting at night. I mean, this is days suitable for field work.
Right. So you work longer hours or whatever. I mean, that definitely comes into it. Yeah.
What I notice about that one is all the instances of less than 12 days of being available are since 1990.
Yep.
Yeah.
Likewise, all the instances of more than 20 days
Before 2000.
are before 2000. So you've really had some shifts between long periods available and very short periods available. And a break someplace in the mid-1990s.
Well, that's another thing that we talked about that would be interesting to look at, is break this, only look at, maybe this section, or, and see what the trend line looks at with a different window of time. But so that's Iowa. And then the other one that I will touch on quickly was Missouri during the fall harvest season. So they're actually seeing more days, which is that's interesting, and that's another thing that a farmer's probably not going to run out and buy a new combine, a smaller combine, but 20 years down the road, they might want to reassess, what size of a combine they have, because they have a lot more days suitable. And when you go back to the histograms, you have a much higher percentage of days suitable in the fall. In your active time frame, the majority of your days are suitable to be in the field, whereas in the spring is really kind of when the crunch is to get everything in the ground.
You better get your psychology hat out, though, and
get into, okay, do I want to buy a smaller combine?
Right, yeah, nobody wants to do that. I'll just get more acres, right? So then, like I said, we wanted to take this data suitable for fieldwork data because to some people that doesn't mean anything. Obviously, you guys understand the value of that and how that applies. But to tie it back into planter expenses. So this example, this is just one example in Iowa. So the machinery cost per acre here was around $7 for the planter. And then I calculated the yield penalty. So you have your most active window when you're fine, you get all your crops in. And then after that, you're going to start seeing a yield penalty when you plant beyond that window. And so this showed that around 35 to 36 percentile is where you would want to plan for, which was interesting to see because in a lot of the literature, they were thinking it was even lower than that. But like I said, this is just one example, one scenario, one farm size, one planter size. So this could vary a lot based on all those things. Corn yields, your working rate, like you said, how many hours are they working? And but anyway, so yes, this shows around 30 to 35%.
If you're getting ready to change a slide, Sam Funk has a couple of questions for you.
Oh, yep.
That would apply, I think, to both planting and harvesting.
Okay.
He said, haven't we seen some folks moving their planting windows as well? Earlier planting is his first
Yeah,
question.
so the planting windows, it was interesting. In Iowa, it shifted a little bit. In Iowa, it actually just narrowed. It moved about 1 week earlier, but it just narrowed. And so Iowa actually, as I mentioned, their most active time frame was a 4-week window. Whereas in Kansas and Missouri, they had a lot longer stretch that it took them to get from the 15% to the 85% complete for planting. So that was another interesting point. In Iowa, you've got a shrinking window as well. So
You say it's moved earlier?
it had shifted on average, I think, a week earlier, but it also shortened. So there really, I thought there would actually be more change there. But that's another thing that could lead to a whole other set of research questions. Why has it changed? Has it actually changed because of weather, or has it changed because of technology? You've got no-till. So there's a lot of other things that play into that question. So.
Yeah, and partly it may be it's shortened because we're getting it done quicker.
Right. You have to.
You're moving it up because you're hitting 85% quicker.
Right.
But
yeah, and technology is a big thing too.
Yeah, the Kansas and Missouri to me is very explainable. One, they warm up much earlier than us.
Right. So they start a lot.
And their
earlier.
frost-free dates are actually later, so they are much less critical. They have a much wider planting date.
Mm-hmm. And it also depends. There's other crops that come into play here too. This is kind of just focusing on corn. So you also think about the crop mix in each of those respective locations too. And so they might place more priority on another crop. So they kind of get their corn done when they get their corn done. Whereas here in Iowa, it's mainly corn and beans. So.
Sam's second question, on the notion of 2 planters, how do we account for some hired machinery for planting and harvesting when time available is compressed?
So that's another good question. And kind of throughout this analysis, we were just talking about, a planter is owned by the farmer. So there is that option that you could just custom harvest or, custom plant a lot of that. And so that is another question that comes into play. At what point do you just want to hire somebody else to do that? And maybe, maybe they're located in that other county, and so you could just hire them to kind of fill in that. But yeah, that's another question. What costs do you want? Are you willing to assume for that?
And then he made a comment, just barely, earlier planting windows and shorter season crops caused earlier harvests in Missouri to move prior to Thanksgiving and Christmas long term. Yeah, and
that's another thing that we talked about a lot. So you might be planting earlier, but does that necessarily mean earlier harvest? Or you might, when we were talking about the yield penalties, you might plant late. But once again, does that actually mean you're going to harvest later? Not necessarily. You're either, if you don't get your corn in time, you might just switch to soybeans. You might just switch to a different variety with shorter date to mature. So there's a lot of moving parts here to consider, which is why it's such an interesting topic, and there's a lot of questions and a lot more research that could be done on it.
And he says, trust me, Missouri harvests are earlier than when I was a kid.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would have to go back and look specifically at what Missouri's time frame looked at. I don't remember that one off the top of my head. But yeah, there definitely was a small shift in most instances, but yeah.
Does Iowa harvest early or late? Is there any difference than the last 40, 50 years?
I don't think it had changed a ton. I would have to go back and look at my spreadsheet, but
I can't imagine it has, just in the fact that he said with the window, it hasn't really gotten any earlier. So it hasn't moved, the planting date opportunities haven't really moved forward to, about now.
With the earlier planting, I think Iowa is using slightly longer maturities on corn. So harvest hasn't necessarily changed much because it's allowed us to extend maturities, where in a place like Missouri, they were already using full season corn, so it actually could have more effect in Missouri and Kansas than it did in Iowa, where we, particularly the northern half of the state, where there tends to be a yield advantage by being able to extend maturity.
yeah, and so one of the professors on my committee was actually from the agronomy department down at K-State. So it was really interesting to hear kind of how he interpreted all of this and some of those options on seed maturity and different varieties that you might use and how that affects everything. Change that one. So the last one I have here, this is kind of just another look at that last slide. So this one looks at two different planter sizes, and you can see once again it's looking at the corn to planter price ratio. And so looking at that, when you're kind of in the expected range, it still falls kind of here in the 30 to 35% days suitable for fieldwork percentile, even with both of those two different planter sizes. But this is another thing that we talked about, that you could build on this a lot. This is kind of just one example. This is one farm size, one crop price, and so there's a lot more that you could build on here too and look at this a little closer. So some of the ideas for further study we've talked about a lot right now, but one was to expand that cost-benefit analysis I just showed you to a more specific level than just the state. So the state's pretty generic, and I also just looked at Iowa on that, so we could look at that at more states and maybe a more specific level. And then additionally, one that we talked about quite a bit was to expand the days suitable for fieldwork regression analysis to the crop reporting district level. In Iowa, we saw the trend line for Iowa. That was just the state. So taking that and looking at it for each one of those crop reporting districts, and that was especially of interest in Kansas because there was no trend at the state level in Kansas. But like we talked about, Kansas differs a lot from one side to the other, and so that kind of washes out the trends. So that was one place that we thought it would be beneficial to look at it at a more specific level than just the state to see what kind of trends exist. And then, as we mentioned too, analyze the additional weather trends, so tie in maybe precipitation, growing degree days to see how that correlates with those days suitable for field work over time. And then finally here, we just wanted to mention some of the other projects at DIS that we've been working on recently that might be of interest to some. Some of you in this room already know we're going to do an update to the multi-state land use study that we did a few years ago. So that's in the works, and there will be several other state farm bureaus that are wanting to participate in that too. As I mentioned here, there might be some additional weather analysis, or add in a few more states to this and see what it looks like on a multi-state picture. And then also within the last year, DIS has completed a policy analysis tool for Ohio Farm Bureau, and that's another thing that kind of demonstrated the benefit of their Farm Bureau and their policy initiatives to their members, and that's another one that might be of interest to some other state farm bureaus down the line. So you've already asked a lot of good questions, but is there any more?
Well, your data that's coming in is all based, at least in Iowa, on crop reporting districts.
Mhm.
Is there a layer of weather information that's acceptable so that you really are comparing not so much the boundaries of the districts, but the boundaries of the weather patterns?
We talked about that too. There is pretty good Mesonet data, but that's another one that is very, do you trust, how much do you trust it? You know, Spence has a little weather station at his house, and I asked him the other day how much rain they got. Well, it had shut off, you know, so you never know how accurate that data is. But that was another thing that we did talk about that might be interesting to try and layer that with what we've got here. But there would definitely be some challenges.
How far back does that go?
I would have to look. I don't know.
Mesonet data?
It depends on the state.
Depends on the
too.
location,
This far.
but into the 1890s on some data. 20 or 30 stations that go back 100 plus years. Most of the states, at least into the 1950s, but a lot of stations, you could get good coverage across Iowa clear back into the 1800s.
Well, the reason I'm asking that, it's kind of like determining hail belts and hail insurance costs and that type of things based on historical weather patterns and so forth.
Des Moines is one, for example, that goes back, I think, into the 1890s. Sheridan, I think, was 1921 or 22.
The challenge with trying to do this analysis on that type of a geography is that you don't have days suitable for field work. But anything that you could do with
Right,
that.
you wouldn't have that on the, but, so one of my professors had also brought this up, you know, wondering about using some weather data. And he was saying to develop your own measure of, so like, for example, days suitable for field work in Iowa in the spring, it's too wet or you can get in the field. Like those are your two options. And so he was saying use the weather precipitation data and kind of create your own measure
With
of.
a lag, probably.
Right, which, yeah, so that'd be.
A lag and an accumulation factor both would be in there, but and that's the thing is that would be kind of an interesting thing to do is to take the days suitable for field work and try and predict that with precipitation data.
Yeah.
So accurate.
And maybe it's precipitation / temperature data,
Temperature.
because there probably is a temperature.
And wind speed too.
Soil
Wind
type.
speed too.
Soil type too.
So, I mean, yeah, soil type. So there was that opens a whole other
Yeah.
can of worms, you know, what all do you include? But it would be an interesting way to look at
It'd
this.
probably be more of a thing, looking forward type thing, so whoever's doing this 20 years from now would have that kind of.
Right.
So find out the covariate that we can correlates with the days suitable for fieldwork to forecast that one, predict that one.
Yeah, can you predict days suitable for field work based upon precipitation and whatever temperature, wind, etc.? What factors might be able to predict that? And because then, if you've got a good model that can, because those factors are available at micro levels,
Yeah.
so if you can predict them basically at the larger area, either crop reporting district or the state level, can we assume that that equation will hold for the micro level? That's not a bad assumption, but
Right.
Getting back to Rick's original question, though, you're trying to predict the subjective thing.
Yes.
So,
Yep. That was another thing. They were looking at the data, and one of them was like, how do you have like 1.3 days suitable for field work? Well, it's because it's a bunch of averages.
yeah.
So that's what they were asking. Is it full days or is it partial
3
days?
people said 2 days and 7 people said 1
Yeah.
day.
Yeah.
having been one of the reporters that filled those reports out, I know how they're done.
You're like,
I did those.
Yeah, what kind of training did you get on that? Yeah.
Here's the form. But it was mostly filled out by either agronomy or farm management extension people. That's the number one. I think, I don't know whether NRC, in some places, NRCS personnel may be making that estimate, depending on the county. But the good news is it's not as bad as you might think because of the law of large numbers.
Right.
Now, the state number is probably pretty good. The crop reporting district number is okay. But I can tell you from experience that once in a while, particularly like on corn planting progress, I didn't travel enough of the county, and I got biased by a small locality, between my home and the office, if you hadn't traveled out, and I wanted to go backward, I had, we're 40% done, and then I traveled the county and said, we're probably only 15% done. You can't go backwards. If you reported 40, they will not take you backwards. So I do know a few of the limitations that occasionally planting progress early in the system will actually tend to slightly overestimate the progress.
That's human, probably, yeah. So you'd think that maybe a different type of system might be more useful, where it's a variety of producers across the county actually reporting what they're experiencing as opposed to one county.
The larger the reporting set on any of these, it's really somewhat similar when I was at AFBF, we did our own USDA crop survey data, and I sent out, I probably worked with Ed and stuff back, or Glee Mulder or whatever back in the day, but we had a model and we were getting 6,000 observations from around the country, and we were simply asking farmers to rate their yield within 25 bushel increments. 100 to 125, 125 to 50. All you got to do is check the box. Which increment are you in? And with that, with 6,000 observations, I could be within 0.5% of the USDA number. I don't need accuracy at the individual level if I've got enough volume. The law of large numbers will push it to the right mean. And that's the idea behind this, is if you've got even 20 observations in a crop reporting district, the crop reporting district isn't too bad, but if you've got 200 observations in a state, that state number is actually pretty good.
Develop an app and sell it to NAS and just
have farmers plug in there.
On
Yeah.
the phone, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Honestly, yeah. Mm-hmm.
More useful number for a lot of
things, yeah.
So did you mention, is there a consideration to this building on rating of crop insurance premiums? That was discussed a little bit. But.
I didn't really dig into that. That's definitely something that you could build on, add in here. Yeah. So that's one thing. We want to keep you guys in the loop on what we're working on, because you guys have a lot more ideas of what we can, how this is useful to you.
Use the data to do a study, and Dakota's and prove to them they should be planting corn.
Yeah. All right. Well, nobody has any more questions. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. Very good.